Oh, this is William Henry. This is Dreamland. Welcome, everyone. Many believe a great shift in human consciousness is unfolding. We're literally morphing right before our eyes. And there's a sense among some that we're entering a period in which the human mind will reveal its potential superhuman powers and become, well, cosmic. This suggests that we are rediscovering ourselves and what it means to be human. Are we beings that can create or co-create our own realities? Our guest today, Dr. Robert Schoch, has deeply considered these questions from the vantage point of academia's highest towers and as a boots-on-the-ground investigator carrying out research on ancient pyramids and megalithic structures around the world. He's world-famous for his work on dating the Sphinx and for taking on the Egyptology establishment. With John Anthony West, he created a paradigm shift in our understanding of ancient Egypt, and along the way, he collected important data about the mind. His latest work, The Parapsychology Revolution, a concise anthology of paranormal and psychical research, contains selections from 14 seminal papers dating from 1886 to 2007 by all the major figures in the field. Roberts concluded that the lessons of parapsychology may be crucial to addressing the current and future evolution of humanity. He's here to talk with us about human paranormal abilities as well as explore the possibility that ancient temples and ritual sites were used to focus energies and enhance Analoma's mental capabilities. Here is Dr. Robert Schoch. Robert, welcome to Dreamland.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
It was my pleasure to meet you recently, Dr. Schoch, at the CPAC conference.
Yeah, that was wonderful.
I really enjoyed your presentations, which I'd like to talk about you with here in a moment on our relationship with the Galactic Center and how it might, in fact, play a role in triggering paranormal abilities.
Okay.
Your interests, though, they run wide and deep. They focus on interrelationships, it seems, between geological and astronomical phenomena, natural catastrophes, the early history of human civilization. So how did this flow into an interest in parapsychology and advanced human capabilities?
Well, I have spent a lot of time, as you've already mentioned, looking at ancient monuments around the world, but really, my first and foremost focus has been on Egypt. And what I've found is looking at not just the Egyptian monuments, but monuments in general, I had to ask myself, well, why are they building these huge monuments? This is sort of an eternal question. Why build a pyramid? Why put all the energy and time and resources into doing such a thing? I've never bought the standard argument that it's just, a huge tomb for a pharaoh in the case of the Great Pyramid, etc. And I found consistently that there are these stories, both ancient stories, and I don't mean that in any kind of derogatory way, but stories, tales, myths, if you would, legends, that interesting things are happening in these structures, in these monuments, in these temples, the Great Pyramid in particular, and they seem to relate to altered states of consciousness, if you want to put it that way, maintaining higher levels of consciousness. Sometimes it would be phrased in terms of connecting with the gods, going through some kind of spiritual evolution. And even though I might have been skeptical and I'm trained as a classical scientist, when you keep hearing the same types of stories over and over for different monuments around the world, I'm trained in part in anthropology, you see the same stories consistently among different cultures. You have that among ancient people. You have modern people saying they've experienced things. I had to start looking at and saying, might there be something to all of this?
Now, when you're talking about ancient people, many would suggest that the Great Pyramids were built around 2500 BC, and that would be approximately the date of the Sphinx. But you might have a different definition of ancient. Talk about that.
Ancient, much of ancient goes much further back. Those familiar with my work know that I sort of became, should we say, notorious at first for my work on the Great Sphinx. I was brought into that, as you already mentioned, by John Anthony West to look at the Great Sphinx geologically. And what I found is that the Sphinx does not go back just to 2500 BC, but it goes back thousands of years earlier.
How many thousands of years earlier?
At least 5,000 to 7,000 BC, so at least several thousand years earlier, maybe more than that. It's very difficult for me to say geologically how far back it could go, but we're talking at least 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years earlier than most Egyptologists would want to accept our traditional Egyptologists will accept. And the thing is, this puts it well back into prior to dynastic times, well back before pharaonic times.
Well before 3000 BC.
Well before 3000 BC. And I've been told over and over, by classical Egyptologists and archaeologists, well, no one existed to build such a thing.
Right.
No one could have done that. And I say, that's not my problem. I'm a geologist. I'm telling you how far back it goes, and I'm very, comfortable with my data, and that, more and more evidence as we bring it in demonstrates it's correct.
And they can take it or leave it. I recently, I've interviewed Egyptologist or Egypt researcher Stephen Mailer. He had a teacher, Abdel Hakim, who was a local guide there in Giza, and Hakim told Stephen Mailer that the ancient Egyptians possessed 360 senses, some of which we today would have to call paranormal.
Right, exactly. I don't know about 360 per se, but certainly my research on ancient Egypt would confirm that they knew a lot more than we know now. For instance, a lot of people are familiar that the Egyptians had different concepts for different parts of the human. And when I say parts of the human, I'm not talking body parts. I'm talking, what we might call spirit, soul, shadow, etc. In fact, they had dozens of terms, which I think was not just redundancy, but in fact they were distinguishing different, what I'll call psychical aspects of human consciousness, human mentality.
So, did we possess advanced mental abilities in the past? Did we lose them, and how can we get them back?
Well, there certainly is a lot of evidence, in my opinion, that we humans did possess certain mental capabilities. Let's call them advanced, if you like, but things that we don't possess nowadays. And I think that in some cases, ancient cultures, people talk about ancient cultures being, maybe we've lost something, were they more sophisticated than us in some respects, and I think perhaps so, and not necessarily a technological or mechanical sophistication, although when you look at something like the Great Pyramid or the Great Sphinx, how were they doing that even from a basic technological aspect, how were they moving 70-ton blocks, etc., it boggles the mind. But I don't think that was actually the first and foremost concern of those ancient cultures. I think it was more what we could call mental consciousness, psychical abilities, and it's very difficult to know exactly what they were doing because we have lost so much.
It's been speculated that soon we'll be able to develop computer interface devices that will be able to pick up waveforms captured by trees or the antenna of bugs, and that we may be able to tap into those stones and read the waveforms. Yes, that's something
I'm very interested in and pursuing myself, and others are pursuing, is how could these stones, how could the background, if you would, how could the monuments tap in and capture, how could we tap into them, how have they captured things in the past? Part of it, I think, is that it's not just the monuments themselves, but it's actually the spots on Earth. There are different, it's well known geologically, there are different geomagnetic forces on different spots in the Earth that manifest themselves. And it's also becoming better and better known that these geomagnetic forces affect us in terms of mental abilities, consciousness, etc. Well, so in some cases, they were clearly, in my mind, building temples, building pyramids, building structures on specific sites that would enhance consciousness.
Let me ask you this. You did your graduate work at Yale.
I did.
I was recently in New Haven.
Oh, wow.
Did a presentation on the Yale campus and had a chance to walk around, went to the library there, held the Voynich manuscript in my hands. That was a real treat. And
oh, wow.
I met a gentleman who talked about the unusual geology of New Haven, or New Heaven.
Right.
And he was speculating that you've got all these volcanic escarpments there, and you've got the nearby place. I can't remember, what was the name of that? There's a special park there in New Haven, famous park.
Yeah, it's been decades since I've been there.
Yeah, well, what he was saying is that there's a reason why Yale is a king-making site in America. There's a reason why American presidents go to Yale.
To Yale, yeah.
Why the titans of industry go to Yale.
Work.
It's because of the geology of Yale.
Yeah, I think that makes some sense. You get certain areas environmentally that are conducive to, should we say, mental abilities processes. And I could easily see that in terms of New Haven.
Very interesting, because it should suggest that when they're picking the locations of some of these early American sites, Yale dates back to the 17th century, 18th
right,
century.
Exactly.
That they knew.
They knew, and was it on a conscious level or was it on a subconscious level? Either way, I think they knew something. They were sensing something. And see, I think the same principles apply to the classical ancient sites. I believe in most cases it applies to, for instance, in Europe, sites for cathedrals, that type of thing, holy sacred sites. You're picking up something at those spots.
And what we need to do is just go there with an open heart, an open mind, and be able to kind of tap in. Those stones still speak to us. I've had the experience in Egypt and elsewhere of the stones speaking, and it's real.
It absolutely is real. I mean, I think once people experience it, and you know that firsthand, once people experience it, there's no denying it.
Robert, we've come up to a break here. When we get back, let's talk about a century of research and experiments into paranormal abilities and what it's brought us. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We're continuing with Dr. Robert Schoch. Dr. Schoch, are you a skeptic when it comes to the paranormal, or were you a skeptic, I should say, because it sounds like you've opened up to it considerably. And what's been the result of your immersion in this field of study?
Well, I'd like to think of myself as always a skeptic, but as a skeptic with a little s, not someone who's a debunker, not someone who throws the term skeptic around as if, it's some kind of grand title and they're going to disprove everyone. I think what we need to do, and I think everyone should do this, is, really be open to things, but that means be open to both sides of things. So really look at things critically. Don't, buy everything you hear, everything that everyone says to you, but on the other hand, don't dismiss things when there's good evidence for them. So that's how I define myself as a skeptic. Sometimes I use the term true skeptic. But I think it's important to distinguish between that and the debunkers of the world, skeptics with a capital S.
And we all know that you've been subjected to the ploys of the debunkers and the true skeptics.
Absolutely. I mean, they're all over, and they want to make your life miserable.
And you're such a nice guy. How could anybody want to make your life miserable?
It's horrible. It's horrible. I really try to go into this with an open mind. And an open mind means, looking at both sides of things and not being afraid to follow evidence where it leads. So when anyone presents me with new information or a new site or a new experience that they've had, I immediately question it in my own mind, if not up front with them. And I look into it. And one thing that I've found, and very important to me as a natural scientist, because I am trained as a scientist and I'm trained as a field scientist, that's what I mean by natural scientist, is to look at cases. So when someone starts describing experience to me that they've had and it fits right in with the pattern of similar experiences, I have little doubt about it. On the other hand, there are certain things when people are, I hate to say it crudely, lying to you because they're describing something that makes absolutely no sense in the bigger picture, does not fit what we know about the subject matter. So in some cases you get, doesn't mean they're absolutely wrong, but in some cases you get a funny sense right away, and your skepticism goes up rather than down.
There it is, that extra sense that is putting up the signal. Let's walk for a second here before we run. What abilities are considered paranormal? Okay,
I consider paranormal, when I discuss paranormal, I usually use it in a strict, or we could call it academic sense. So the classic paranormal ability would be telepathy, or sometimes the old-fashioned term for it is thought transference, mind-to-mind interactions without any kind of intermediary, not using the typical known senses. That's sort of classic paranormal or topic of parapsychology. And that is absolutely, in my opinion, is the best validated. I mean, it's very clear that it's real and has been demonstrated both in field studies and in many laboratory studies that telepathy is real. So that's classic. Other classic paranormal is what's known as psychokinesis, or PK, essentially mind over matter. And that is much more controversial even among people who study such things. But I believe that there's good evidence for it both in laboratory-type settings. For instance, the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research laboratories for over a quarter century did many studies in what we call micro-PK, looking at the influence of mind on systems, many of which were subatomic or at the atomic molecular level, and how they could be influenced by simple consciousness, by simple mental concentration.
I thought it was interesting that in the book you went back and pulled in some studies from the late 1800s, well before the idea of the quantum was expressed, before even in today's quantum entanglement, but yet they all seem to be kind of aiming at that and indirectly or sometimes even directly inferring that they had some kind of knowledge of that.
Exactly. In fact, I mean, one thing I found in researching this book and putting together the anthology is that some incredible work in the field was done in the late 1800s, in the late 19th century. I mean, you had some of the best minds in the world, literally, tackling what we now call the paranormal, or what we now call parapsychology. And part of it, I think, was in that milieu, there wasn't as much stigma associated with the topic as there is now. So you could have Nobel Prize-winning physicists 100 years ago talking about the paranormal, studying the paranormal, and coming to what in hindsight are some amazingly modern conclusions.
Yeah, it's incredible. And then all of a sudden we have this explosion after Einstein's theory of relativity. It's like the imagination suddenly was expanded, and all of a sudden we start to realize as a consequence that hey, we might be embedded in like a common psychical environment, like a collective mind, a thought bubble. What do you think about that?
Yeah, exactly. I think we definitely are. I mean, I think all the evidence clearly indicates that we are. There's the collective consciousness is sometimes the term is used, sort of a Jungian sense. That's real. That's not just a metaphor. That's not just myth. It's not just a literary way of saying that we all are related to each other. I mean, literally, and this gets back to telepathy. Literally, what goes on in one person's mind affects things. It affects other people. I was just talking about psychokinesis. I mean, mental processes can affect material at some level. I was going to say the other two aspects of psychokinesis that I think are very well documented in certain cases, and you have to be careful that there's always fraud in all of this. There's always cases of fraud, but that's with any science. There are cases of fraud. But what's sometimes known as, for instance, healing at a distance, or the direct mental processes affecting other living systems, that's very well documented now, too. That sort of borders between telepathy and psychokinesis. And many, many controlled studies, even done by skeptics, arch skeptics with a capital S, have demonstrated that something like that occurs. You can hook up, you mentioned before, plants. Cleve Baxter, the polygraph expert, has done amazing studies going back decades now where he stumbled upon this. He hooked up his polygraphs, lie detectors, to plants, and then realized he wasn't trying to do this. He was trying to look at other things. He realized that his thoughts and intentions were being recorded, were being picked up by the polygraphs, or were being indicated on the polygraphs that were hooked up to the plants. The plants were essentially picking up his thoughts.
The secret life of plants.
Exactly,
I love that.
Exactly. And the interesting thing about that is that it's very replicable. It can be replicated over and over, even to the point that some skeptics have tried to run his experiments. They were expecting to get no results because, of course, they're skeptics. They didn't think it was real. Then they get results, and now they're trying to scurry around, explain them away. It's really amazing.
Why do you suppose there's such a resistance to adopting this worldview and this understanding and allowing it then to transform our world. It seems like if this were common knowledge, it would transform everything in an instant.
Oh, I think it. I think it should transform everything in an instant. There's a lot of problems with it. One is something I alluded to already. There is admittedly in the field a social stigma, should we say, and this goes back to the 19th century and even earlier. There's a lot of fraud, unfortunately, in the sense that a lot of people, when they think, for instance, telepathy or thought experiments, they think of, conjuring tricks, stage magicians who basically fake things. Mm-hmm. And as we all know, I hate to mention him, but one of the grand arch skeptics is James Randi, who is a magician, a stage conjurer, and just because he can claim in some cases he can, and it's not always true, but he claims in some cases he can mimic what other people can do, but he's faking it. He's using conjuring tricks. That doesn't mean that everything is a conjuring trick. But, you have that aspect to it. So you have the whole problem of fraud and trying to sort that out. You also have situations where a lot of these phenomena we're talking about, they're very fickle, if I could put it that way. They're hard to produce on command. Mm-hmm. So many of them are very much emotionally laden. In many cases, you get a strong telepathic experience. For instance, when your mother across the continent, maybe thousands of miles away, she gets really sick or she gets injured, and you feel that immediately. Many people have had experiences like that.
Absolutely.
But that's not something you can easily do on command in an experimental situation where you're going to do, break people's legs to see if their relatives pick it up. You see what I mean?
Right.
I'm not trying to be facetious, but it really becomes very difficult. It's amazing that we've got to as good and consistent laboratory experiments as we have with things like, the classic card calling experiments where you're trying to send telepathically information like what card are you looking at, what playing card, that type of thing. Because that's very unrealistic from what we know about the natural history, I'll use that term, natural history of these types of phenomena. So it's hard to replicate. Another aspect, not to go on too long, is that we still do not have a good encompassing theory to explain these types of phenomena. That doesn't mean they're not real, but in classical science, if you don't have a good theory, it's much more difficult to make headway among your colleagues that a phenomenon is real. So it becomes very difficult. I'm a geologist. Classic example is continental drift. Mm-hmm. Everyone accepts a version of continental drift now. It's called plate tectonics.
Right.
When it was first proposed in the early 1900s, people were laughed at. It was nonsense. The same thing was happening as with parapsychology and the paranormal now. Couldn't be. Everyone knows that continents can't move because there was no theory to explain how they could move, no mechanism. Now, of course, we have one, and everyone accepts that continents move over geologic time.
Robert, we've got to take another quick break. When we come back, let's talk about remote viewing. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Dreamland. Serious wonder spoken here.
This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We're continuing with Dr. Robert Schoch, author of the new book, The Parapsychology Revolution, a concise anthology of paranormal and psychical research. Robert, one of our Dreamland hosts, Jim Mars, wrote a book called Spies, documenting the U.S. Army's formerly top-secret remote viewing unit and how the military has used this psychic ability as a tool and even a weapon during the Cold War. What are your thoughts on remote viewing?
Well, actually, there's definitely something to it. And supplementing what you were just saying, just to plug the book a little bit, we included an article on the same topic by someone in the military who researched it and wrote about it after it was declassified. So it's an incredibly interesting topic, and it was definitely put to good use by the military. there's no question in my mind that remote viewing is real. It can work. The problem is, for military purposes or any other purposes, it doesn't always work as consistently as people would like it to work, and it's subject to interpretation, et cetera, et cetera. It's unclear where it stands right now in the military. Ostensibly, at least some of the programs have been stopped, cut, declassified, but then who knows what programs might be going on that we don't know about that are classified.
And then the marketplace takes over, and you've got some very reputable people teaching remote viewing, and then, of course, you've got the charlatans.
That's right. That's what we were talking about before. You've always got the charlatans. You've always got the frauds. That's the classic thing with remote viewing, or if it's mediums, or, self-proclaimed clairvoyants who want to take advantage of people. Of course, this is no different than any other field.
Right, exactly. Yeah. William Blake once said that if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as infinite. Do you think these our paranormal abilities or natural abilities, which is what they really are, have been brainwashed out of us by a dumbed-down culture?
I think it's been partly brainwashed out of us by a dumbed-down culture. I think there's also a biological component to it.
A survival factor?
A what?
A survival factor?
Yes, a survival factor, because to be honest, remote viewing, telepathy, psychokinesis, any of these phenomena that we're talking about, from a survival point of view, you don't necessarily want to depend on them if you have some other possibility that has a higher level of success. So, for instance, if I'm crossing the street, and this is a silly example, but if I'm crossing the street, I feel more comfortable looking both ways and listening for cars rather than closing my eyes, shutting my ears, and deciding telepathically if someone's driving. Right. Am I making sense?
Yeah.
No, seriously. So, I mean,
right.
and I mean, I know that's a facetious example, but seriously, things like this I think we have to take into account in, again, what I call the natural history of the paranormal phenomena. There are places for it, and there are places not for it. So, for instance, it's well documented that some, we'll call them primitive peoples, like the Australian Aborigines, they apparently use telepathy, and this is very well documented, on a regular basis to pick up information from, hundreds of miles away. They don't have their phones. Well, maybe they have cell phones now, who knows?
Right.
But traditionally, when there was nothing else to use, they honed their abilities. They had survival value. But once, the person's in sight, then you just wave your hand or you scream or something. You don't necessarily rely on telepathy at that point.
Kind of an oddball question, but a lot of times when I leave town, I'll take a cab to the airport and a cab home, and I open the door. My two cats they're sitting right there at the door, right on the counter, right at the door. How do they know I'm home? Well,
they may be applying it. They may be using it. This is maybe similar to things. For instance, there have been studies. Just to throw out another type of instance, where when there are accidents on trains, for instance, it's been found statistically for no reason that we can explain otherwise. A lot of times that day there will be fewer riders on the train than normal. Well, what's going on? One hypothesis is that some level, subconscious, unconscious level, people picked up that there was something wrong, something was going to happen. And short-term precognition is very real, in my opinion. There's a lot of evidence for it. So, people aren't necessarily thinking about consciously, but I think we all have this experience sometimes. You just don't do something, or you do something, and you don't know exactly why, or you don't even think about it. It's a very low fundamental level. And sometimes, people fumble with their keys, or they spill their coffee, or who knows what. As a result, they miss their train or their bus or their airplane or something. Then, again, I'm using classic examples. Then next thing you know, that train was an accident.
And then some people might want to attribute that to like a guardian angel.
Yeah, some would contribute to a guardian angel. That gets into another issue of, are there discarnate spirits? Are they guardian angels? Or is it just a telepathic precognition?
What'd you find?
What?
What did you find as regards to that? Are there ghosts? Are there...
Oh, well, what's my conclusion?
Yeah.
That's a really tough one, because what you're talking about are two different hypotheses for the same thing, and frankly, there's not good evidence to distinguish between them. I mean, that's honestly my initial reaction, because there's very strong evidence for precognition. So are you precognitively knowing something, even if you aren't thinking about consciously but acting on it? I mean, there's a lot of evidence, even non-paranormal, that we do act on phenomena or sensory data without actually having consciously processed it. So could that simply be the case, or is it someone's literal guardian angel, or do the two concepts blend together?
Mm-hmm.
In many cases, what is a guardian angel? Maybe it's just having that little inner knowledge.
Exactly, that voice that comes out of the mind and just says, turn left instead of right, or don't take that train.
So in many cases, I think of something like that. Well, you can label whatever you want, but whatever's happening is real.
But as a scientist, as you look at this, what are you looking for that tells you that it's real? Replicability? A pattern?
Yes, actually, to me, the most fundamental thing for the type of science I do is patterns. In fact, I think that's the fundamental thing in any science. Even laboratory studies where people talk about replicable experiments, what they're really talking about is getting the same pattern consistently over and over. So whether you're talking about a pattern of consistent patterns in phenomena that are being reported by diverse people over diverse times in diverse cultures, or if you're talking about patterns in experiments in diverse labs, you're still talking about pattern recognition. So that's very important to me. And that's actually what convinced me of the reality of these types of paranormal phenomena, is that they don't just occur willy-nilly. They don't just occur, it's not a one-time thing. A lot of skeptics say, well, they just occur, one time, there's no replicability, there's no pattern. But that's not true at all. When you start studying these phenomena, there's very consistent patterns.
Well, and that takes me back to Jim Mars's book about the Psi-Spies, of the possibility of taking this knowledge and developing weapons based on it, the ability to control a population, for example.
Oh, I think that's being done already. Or there have been, in my opinion, and from what I know, that has been tried at least, or that's being developed.
What are some examples of that?
Well, I think there's actually a lot of evidence, and I hate to get into this, but because some of it is, we don't know exactly how well validated it is, and this is something I'm looking into now. But for instance, the former Soviet Union appears to have been trying to develop things like that, maybe even testing it in part on unwilling populations to try to essentially dumb down, in some cases, the collective mental abilities. By essentially what we could call paranormal or telepathic means. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect, which was certainly being developed both in the former Soviet Union and by America in the Cold War, was what we mentioned before, remote viewing. The possibility of being able to, quote, see into military installations, into weapon systems, et cetera, independent of, physically placing spies there, or physically placing bugs there. Both, I think, showed some signs of success. Another thing that's very scary, for instance, I hate to say it, but things like we're so worried about terrorism nowadays.
Right.
And as we become more and more dependent upon very sophisticated electronic gadgetry, computers, that type of thing, they can be disturbed very simply, in the sense of if someone develops a very strong psychokinetic ability to be able to affect things at a microscopic and subatomic level, as the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Program demonstrated could be the case. You could potentially have someone going into fairly sophisticated say, navigation systems and essentially scrambling them.
Wow.
And it would just need to be random scrambling to cause havoc. I mean, there's a lot of scary things there if people really develop it.
Yeah, I mean, I've thought that for a while, Robert. I mean, at the turn of the 20th century, the single most powerful force on the planet was the British Navy.
Yeah.
Today, what's the British Navy? It's nothing. Why?
It's
because
nothing.
the U.S. military came in with technology.
Yeah.
And I've always I have in the back of my mind that there's probably some kid in Indonesia right now that's developing maybe some kind of very simple but very powerful super weapon that can make the U.S. military look like the British Navy.
Oh, absolutely. Commander Bremseth, he included an article, very, very kindly let us reprint this article in our book, Parapsychology Revolution. He calls it Unconventional Human Intelligence Support, Transcendent and Asymmetric Warfare Implications of Remote Viewing.
Right.
And he hits just upon that type of thing that, the standard military, they're very much into, their high sophistication, electronic gadgets, smart bombs, you're going to target things precisely, precision, but everything's based on this high technology and sort of a one-way thinking, one mindset. And all you need is someone getting in there and thinking, as they say, outside the box.
Right.
And it can blow it completely. It can cause havoc.
Powerful. Robert, we've got to take another break. We'll be right back. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. Be right back.
This is Whitley Strieber's Dreamland. We go deeper.
This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We're continuing with Dr. Robert Schoch. Robert, a lot of talk today is about our relationship with the galactic center as we approach the Maya magic date of 2012. Many believe that we'll be experiencing energies reverberating from the galactic center and that these will bring heightened psychic abilities, and others claim hard evidence that our solar system is moving into a more energetic region of the galaxy and that this is going to affect not only social behavior but human consciousness and maybe even crack open latent abilities in our DNA. What are your thoughts about, from the perspective of our psychic abilities, our relationship with the galactic center?
It's really hard to predict exactly what's going to happen, if anything. But on the other hand, I cannot dismiss such speculation whatsoever. Why? Because we talked about patterns before. There are clear patterns of both spontaneous telepathy, spontaneous instances of paranormal abilities in a mental state, with both geomagnetic flux and with our alignment to the galactic center. I mean, the Earth spins on its axis. It positions itself relative to the galactic center to a certain extent, any spot on Earth once every day, effectively, approximately once every day. There have been numerous studies now, very rigorous studies, correlating spontaneous cases of paranormal abilities, for instance, the ability to remote view, correlating with where a person is relative to the galactic center, whether the galactic center is above the horizon or below the horizon, for instance. So I'm convinced that there is some correlation that we know of even on a daily basis. So as we align with it, as the entire Earth aligns with it more firmly as we go toward 2012, for instance, could that cause something? I certainly think it might, but we don't really know enough. At least I don't feel comfortable that we know enough to predict exactly what will happen, what's going to go on.
Good enough. Well, let's then talk about the whole idea of the ending of the Mayan calendar is about the conclusion of a very long time cycle. Mm-hmm. But let's then talk about our natural abilities and time cycles, or world ages.
Oh, yeah. This is a fascinating topic, and as you know, that's something we talked about at the Conference on Precession and Ancient Knowledge. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that this ties into the bigger picture that I'm a geologist, so I think in terms of long time periods in part, and it's very clear that the Earth has undergone different geomagnetic environments over time, and part of that is tied to the galactic center. When we say geomagnetic, we're not talking about just the magnetic field emanating from the center of the Earth, That is affected by everything from the solar cycle, sunspot cycle. It's affected by our alignment to the galactic center. It's affected by our relative position to the other planets in our solar system, to other stars around us, to where we are in the Milky Way. And this has had a tremendous effect on Earth over time. A lot of people will simply dismiss this as being too subtle to have affected consciousness or to affect life. What we're finding now in very rigorous studies is that what referred to as very subtle electromagnetic fields affect our mental abilities, affect our conscious states.
And it can go either way, right?
And it can go either way. Absolutely, it can go either way. Getting back to what I was talking about, even with the geomagnetic studies, fluxes in the geomagnetic field correlate not with simply heightened abilities in some cases, increased ability, for instance, to remote view, in some cases up to a factor of 10 or more, but it also correlates, for instance, with poltergeist instances.
Interesting.
And poltergeist instances, we haven't talked about that yet, but that's another topic which I have become convinced in part by witnessing one myself that I'm sure was absolutely not faked. It was spontaneous. It was real. Poltergeist instances are not necessarily positive, should we say.
Can you share with us some of the details of your experience?
Yeah, I was in a situation where it was actually a very typical poltergeist instance, in the sense that it was with a person who was emotionally worked up, should we say, upset about certain things, etc., and actually something came up in conversation that sparked, what should we say, emotional outburst, but not a physical anything. And then next thing you know, things are falling off the shelf, a book in particular with a topic that was related to the subject at hand.
Wow.
And I saw it directly come off, and I'm telling you, it did not fall off because of gravity. No one was close to it. Nothing shook. It was essentially, I'm convinced it occurred. But
wow.
most poltergeist instances, as I've studied them, are focused on an individual who usually has some kind of emotional issues they're working through, and essentially, if you want to think about it, psychic energy being thrown off and affecting material objects around. In some cases, it can cause noises. In some cases, it causes things to fly off shelves or, things to break, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, it kind of goes to that adage they have in positive thinking circles that thoughts are things, energies.
Absolutely.
Motion is energy.
And we include in the book an article by William Roll on poltergeist. He's probably the foremost authority in the 20th century, and he points out, for instance, and consistently in studies of real poltergeist phenomena, because there's absolutely fraud too. People, like to attract attention to themselves in some cases and get a movie made about themselves, even if it's not real. But in real cases, for instance, it's typical that the size and mass of objects that are affected drops off with the distance from the person who seems to be the center of the poltergeist, which is what you would expect from a natural science point of view. If it's some kind of energy emanating from them, that objects closer will be affected, with more likelihood than further objects. Objects with, it correlates with their mass, etc. And again, these are the types of patterns that I find very convincing that the phenomenon is real.
Mm-hmm. Robert, we've just got a few minutes left. What's next on your horizon?
Oh, well, I'm continuing to pursue these topics. I mean, for a long time, I have to admit that for a long time I was interested in the paranormal and parapsychology before I, should we say, came out and started talking about it publicly. But there's no turning back at this point. So I'm continuing to pursue it. Something that's of great interest to me, and I am working on, is essentially trying to develop a theory or a more comprehensive hypothesis, should we say, that would account for paranormal phenomena.
What are you calling it?
Well, I haven't got a good name for it.
We haven't got the hook yet.
But I'm working on it. I've got to get the hook. But see, I think to me this is very important. This is actually one of the major criticisms among the skeptics is that there's no good encompassing theory to explain them, so they simply want to dismiss them. Again, as I used the analogy before, continental drift was rejected until there was a good theory to explain it. So that's something that fascinates me, and I have to admit I'm working on it at the moment.
Wonderful. Well, as I said earlier, you're like the perfect bridge because you're so multidisciplinary and you have boots-on-the-ground experience as well as the actual academic background to be able to support it.
Well, thank you.
Just one more question about Egypt. Where are we going with Egypt? Is there going to be any movement on acceptance of a earlier date for the Sphinx?
Actually, I think there is movement. I mean, it's got into a situation where a lot of the critics have, how should I say, I believe they are not as vociferous as they used to be. They're not as vocal as they used to be. I haven't been called as many names recently. And part of it is that the data has stood up. It's stood the test of time, and other geologists that have gone over there have confirmed it. That's one aspect. The second aspect is that we are now finding more and more evidence for sophisticated cultures going back much earlier than the conventional archaeologists have claimed they should. When I first got involved in the Egypt and the redating of the Sphinx, that was the early 90s. That was almost 20 years ago now. And it was sort of in a vacuum that the Sphinx could be so ancient. Now, for instance, we have sites in Turkey where you've got large-scale megalithic structures that have been dated to the same period. In Egypt itself, we have more work, for instance, down in southern Egypt, coming from the same period. There's evidence from England, the Stonehenge area, etc. So what was once isolated, it's harder and harder to dismiss when you're getting all this other evidence showing that, in fact, at that very remote period, there was more happening than conventional archaeology ever admitted.
Well, now if we can just get those stones to speak a little bit louder, perhaps by amping up our own abilities, we might be able to learn something.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's another of the goals.
Well, Robert, it's been a true pleasure talking with you. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your thoughts with us, and best of luck in all your future endeavors. We'll look forward to that theory of everything on our paranormal abilities.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. Once again, Dr. Robert Schoch. The book is The Parapsychology Revolution, a concise anthology of paranormal and psychical research. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. Next up, Linda Moulton Howe.
You're listening to Dreamland's unique blend of information and ideas.
A person has a close encounter experience, and then afterwards something very odd happens. A stranger shows up, human-looking but perhaps alien, who has detailed knowledge about the eyewitness's life or future. Well, now one such witness has been talking to somebody we all know and love, Linda Moulton Howe, Dreamland's ace science reporter. She brings you the facts that others dare not even speak about. Her website, earthfiles.com. Don't miss a single day of this Emmy Award winner's marvelous website. Here she is from Albuquerque, Linda Moulton Howe.
Thank you, Whitley. As a professional journalist, I know that men and women who work in police departments and sheriff's offices are often exposed to many high strangeness events that are never reported to the public. I know that firsthand from those in law enforcement who told me they had come to the conclusion as far back as the 1970s that the perpetrators of worldwide animal mutilations, to use their words, was being caused by creatures from outer space, unquote. But most of them would not speak on the record in front of my TV camera. So when I receive a letter or email or phone call from a retired law enforcement professional who says he is still haunted by an encounter with a large unidentified aerial craft that occurred in 1992, I pay attention and I try to follow up. And that's what happened this fall with John M. Spaulding, who has given me permission to use his full real name. He was born in 1945 and is now retired at age 63 with a serious breathing disability that might be linked to his UFO encounter in 1992. He worked in law enforcement in Rumford, Maine, and the Colorado Springs region of Colorado from 1982 until 2001. He was a chief investigator for detectives when he retired because of his physical disability. In the late fall of 1992, he was working for the state police based in Colorado Springs, but to make ends meet for his family, he held another job in restaurant management at night. His strange story begins as he got into his car around 5 p.m. to go to the restaurant. It was nearly winter season and the sun had set, but the sky was still gray.
At that time, in 92, I had two jobs. I was a state police officer for Colorado during the day, and at night I was a manager of a upscale restaurant and lounge in Colorado Springs. So my normal work hour in the evening is 6 o'clock until 3 in the morning. I was on my way to work. I was going to leave a little early that night. I wanted to eat dinner there at work before I actually went on shift. So I backed out of my driveway. My house sat across the street from one of the city golf courses there. When you get to that stop sign, you have to turn left or turn right. Of course, I always turn right. If you look down the end of that fairway is the tee box where people would tee off on that hole. And you always had to look down there because if you turn at the wrong time and somebody hit a ball, it might come through your windshield. So you look down there, and I looked up, and I noticed over the top of the trees and probably 1,000 yards away were what appeared to be landing lights of a large aircraft. Now, that portion of Colorado Springs is heavily military. You got Fort Carson on one end, you have Int Air Force Base or Pete Field out on the far east side, and up north you have the Air Force Academy. A lot of military around there, but flight patterns were not over our area. So this was not a normal flight pattern for any plane to be in. And I looked up at that plane, and it was only a couple hundred yards off the ground. And I'm thinking, my God, this guy's going to crash, and he's going to hit me. I can't get out of the way. And I kind of froze, to tell you the truth, and was looking at this thing. The longer I looked at him, the more I realized he wasn't moving very fast. I mean, he was moving extremely slow. I thought, what the heck is that? I couldn't figure it out. So I backed the car up a little bit, and I parked. I got out, and I walked across the street, and there's a 6-foot chain link fence that separates the public from the golf course there. I leaned up against that fence, and I watched this, whatever it was, these two lights, and they seemed to be about 50 to 60 feet apart from one another, and it came over the top of these stand of trees on the opposite side of the fairway there on number 9. It came over the top of those trees, and it just stopped right there. And then it lowered itself to probably 50 feet off the ground, maybe. And the lights were there, but I couldn't see it. I could see the trees through it. I could see the sky through it. And I couldn't see this thing.
When you say you could see the sky and the trees through it, you mean through the light?
You have to picture this. If you had a light in your left hand, a light in your right hand, you extended your arms straight out. Mm-hmm. That space in between those two lights you could see through. It stopped for a second, and I thought, this thing's getting ready to move. It didn't turn. It stayed in the same position, but it moved slightly to the right or south. It stopped, and I thought, the thing's getting ready to leave. So I jumped in my car, and sure enough, it started going down south, down the street, down the fairway. That area of town is heavily filled with two-story Victorian-type houses. And I'm thinking he's going to hit one of those houses. And I'm thinking he's going to hit that house at the end of the street. And he got to that house, and he stopped, and then he went up, over, and went, pew, and was gone. I'm telling you, in just the blink of an eye, he was gone. And whether he left or whether he shut off the lights and just sat there, I don't know. All I know was it was gone. So, thinking, I don't know what that was, but I think I'll keep this one to myself. So, I went on to work, and looked at my watch when I got to work. I hadn't lost any time to speak of, maybe 5 or 8 minutes. To the left, as you come in, there's an elevated, huge horseshoe bar that sits up there. And I noticed that there was a guy sitting at the bar, and he was facing me. So my dinner came, I'm eating my dinner, and every once in a while I'd glance up, and the guy was just sitting there staring at me. And now I'm thinking, oh, I wonder if this is somebody I threw out of here a month or two ago. I don't know who he is. I finish my dinner, and I get up, and I clock in. I'm standing by the front door, and one of my cocktail waitresses comes up, and she has an issue, and every once in a while I glance over, and the guy is still staring at me. Pretty soon she leaves, and the guy gets up, and he walks over to me, and I'm thinking, oh, boy, something's wrong. And he said, can I talk to you? And I said, yeah, sure. He said, how about if we go outside? I thought, oh, the guy wants to fight now. I said, all right, let's go outside. So we went out in front of the building. He said, did you have something funny happen to you on the way to work tonight? And I said, why don't you tell me what happened to me on the way to work tonight? He said, well, we were just checking up on you. I said, oh, why don't you explain that? He said, well, let me explain this. He then stood there and proceeded to tell me about my entire life, from the day I was born to the present moment. And he never missed a thing. He knew everything about me, things I had forgotten about, things that I had tried to keep secret in my life. He knew it all, everything. And then he said something that was kind of funny. He said, do you remember when you were about 6 or 7 years old, there was a strange light, red light, that came in through your parents' house in their front room window, and it illuminated your whole front room. Do you remember that? I said, no, I don't recall that. He said, well, we were checking on you then, too. He said, you're one of the special ones. And then he handed me a card, business card. He says, if you ever want to talk to me again, you can reach me here. I said, okay, thank you. I stuck the card in my pocket, and he turned around and walked away.
Can you describe him?
Sure. He was about 5'11". I would say he weighed about 150 pounds, very thin. He had a beard, brownish hair, full beard and mustache. The color eyes I couldn't tell you because he had glasses on, so I couldn't see his eyes very well. But he wore a pair of blue jeans, and he wore a plaid-type shirt. On top of that, he wore a leather fringe-type jacket. He had on boots, but they were not Western boots. They were square-toed. They were almost like a motorcycle boot, only nicer. He also wore a leather hat like you might see some of the guides wearing down in places like in Australia.
What color was the hat?
Kind of a tannish color, kind of matched the jacket.
And the boots were black?
I think they were real dark brown.
Did you say, how do you know details about my life?
Actually, I was flabbergasted. I was so stunned what this guy was telling me that I couldn't really say anything. But I was thinking things, and apparently he knew what I was thinking because he was saying things to me that I was thinking. The grass area at the golf course where this thing was apparently hovering, the grass in the roughage area there turned brown. And I noticed the next spring they had come out and replaced all that sod in there, got rid of that brown grass, and that grass also turned brown.
And was there a shape to the brownness?
Kind of an oblong, like a big cigar. Seriously. And they changed that grass out in there for the next 3 to 4 years before I moved up to Fairplay. And every year it died out again. I mean, not at the time of year when it should die out. I'm talking spring, summertime, it was dead brown, where everything around it was just pretty green.
And the implication is that whatever the cigar craft was, it was radiating some kind of energy that went into the plants and the soil and stayed there.
That's my guess.
And when you think about the stranger, do you have any intuitive sense about whether he was human or not?
My common sense tells me he was, and my gut feeling says, and you got to remember, I'm an old cop.
Right.
And my gut feeling says, I spent 20 minutes talking to somebody who is not from this world.
But why tie it to the phrase, you're one of the special ones?
That's a good question. That's a real good question. So the rest of the night was uneventful. In fact, for years, everything was uneventful. And then in 95, I moved up to Park County from Colorado Springs and went to work for the Sheriff's Department. And in 97, I started experiencing dizzy spells. So I went to the clinic up there in Fairplay, and they examined me and said, well, you have viral pneumonia. So the only treatment for that is oxygen. You have to be on oxygen 24/7 for a month or however long it takes to get rid of the pneumonia. So I did that. I was on oxygen for a couple of months, and finally went back in, and they said, yeah, it's cleared up. Pneumonia's gone. And I said, well, I can't breathe. Having a hard time breathing. So they did a blood oxygen count on me, and it was very low. They said, maybe we should send you to a pulmonary specialist. So I went to Denver and saw a doctor there, a pulmonary specialist there. He did some tests. He said, we've confirmed the worst. You have idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. He says there's no treatment for it, and there's no cure for it, and you've got about 2 years or less left to live. So I checked out of the hospital, and I worked another almost 2 years until I couldn't function anymore up there. Couldn't get off my oxygen machine. So I resigned from the department. I had to go back in 1999 and have some blood work done. And when I was doing that, it was a male nurse that was working on me. He was injecting the needle, and he says, what do they tell you you have? And I told him, I said, well, they're telling me I have idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. And he looked up, he said, that's what I have. I said, really? He said, yes. He said, I was on the naval ship that had a meltdown on the nuclear reactor. Everybody aboard the ship now has idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis caused by the overexposure to radiation. And I'm thinking now, overexposure to radiation.
Wow. And the grass went brown in the shape of a cigar. And in 1992, you might have been exposed to radiation that caused your disease.
That's plagued my mind for years.
And if that were true, then what would the role be of somebody not human, appearing as human, knowing everything about your life, and saying that they had checked up on you when you were 6 with a red light, and that he was checking in with you about the cigar that you saw, and disappears? Your gut tells you as a longtime police officer that he was not human. Do you have any sense in intuition or dreams that you've had of what might be coming in the next 4 or 5 years, given the fact that you have now outlived the prognosis of death with the disease?
You know, if I could answer that question, Linda, no, I don't have a clue. And I keep expecting something to happen. I keep expecting to have this guy walk up to me again somewhere. If they know where I'm at during the course of my life, they know where I'm at now. Thanksgiving of 2002, we went back for Thanksgiving. During the course of that dinner, it was my mother, myself, my wife, my brother and his wife, 2 nephews and their wives, and kids. And we're all sitting around this huge table. We've had our dinner. So Mom said, anybody got anything new to say? And I said, sure. I got a story to tell you. So I told him the story that I just told you about this sighting, whatever it was, and meeting the guy. When I got to the part about the red light coming in the front room, my mother dropped her fork, and it was just dead silence. She said, I remember that very, very well. She said, this light came in through the window in the front room. You were playing on the floor, and we couldn't figure out what in the world that was. And Dad, she said, got up and went out on the front porch, and he said, there's nothing here. There's nothing out here. And he came back in. That light had illuminated the front room. It was going down one wall, across the floor, up the other wall, across the ceiling. And when Dad went out, it was gone. She said, I remember that like it was yesterday. Nobody spoke for a good long time after that. We didn't have anything to say for the moment.
You must have been stunned that this stranger at the restaurant would have been the one who told you about an event that you did not remember, but that your mother did.
Yeah. I didn't remember it because I was about 6 years old at the time. She remembered it because it was apparently eventful enough for her to remember. It was kind of a shocker to Mom and Dad, apparently, that they couldn't figure out where that light was coming from or what it was doing in the house.
If the stranger is from another universe, the beyond, why would there be only a few of these incidents in life described by only a few people?
Well, I really don't have an answer for that question other than possibly they do have a select few that they want to use as a medium. You know, here's what's going on. We know about you. Now you know that we're here. Tell people. Whatever happened to me and whatever has happened to others, especially those who have vivid accounts of abduction, is beyond my normal scope of thinking. I mean, it's just how do you deal with that? I don't have a bunch of visions, and I can't foretell the future, and I have a hard time remembering yesterday. I also have an expectation that whoever or whatever these beings are going to make a full disclosure, or at least our government may make a full disclosure in the very near future. I think that's going to occur. I just think there's no way about it. They can't hide it anymore.
Now, this was 16 years ago, 1992 to 2008. And Whitley, what intrigues me is that he sat with us inside of his mind, wrestling it around, not talking to anybody about it, as he said, until he finally decided this year, this fall, to send me an email with some of the details, and I followed up. And now I have been able to do this interview with a man with a long law enforcement career who is as baffled as all of us are about this phenomenon. But there has to be, as he said to me, a reason for why he finally reached out to contact somebody, because he feels more strongly now than he has in these 16 years that this strange character who was sitting and staring at him in that restaurant in Colorado Springs is still around and is going to show up, because John Spaulding feels, not knowing how much longer he's going to live, that there is something urgent about right now and what is coming in relationship to whatever was in that craft and whatever was the real story about the stranger. He has even gone so far, just this fall, finally, of 2008, to look through his belongings for that business card from 16 years ago, and has now reached out to an old friend to go to the town that he remembers that the stranger was supposed to be running an antique shop. Mm-hmm. Right now, as I am speaking to you, that friend is trying to track down the stranger for John Spaulding.
My goodness, Linda, how many times I have heard about this stranger and have experienced this stranger in my own life. And, of course, I have two of them. I have the Master of the Key, who was such a stranger, and I have the man I call Mr. Crew, who was such a stranger. And, you know, it's such a haunting thing that so many of us have a feeling that things are finally really changing.
Right.
There are changes in Washington that suggest that there could finally be some official disclosure down the road next 6 months or so.
They certainly can't use the collapse of the Wall Street as a reason not to tell the truth.
Not anymore, no. Goodness, no. It has been terrible. I've never seen a collapse like this. I've seen some bad years, of course we all have in Wall Street, but this is beginning to look like the dreaded 1929-34 period, and I think it is just beginning. I think that it's all seems to be sort of part and parcel with the changes that are predicted prior to 2012.
Right.
It's quite extraordinary the way these things keep building up like this.
Yeah.
Well, Linda, it's such a haunting and beautiful story in a way. And, his coming out now, I have to wonder. And what do you think of this? Is there something inside this man that's been triggered? Is that why he came out?
And I often think of the time release capsule phenomenon that I have felt with people in the human abduction syndrome, in which they have said, over the last 20 years, in my lifetime, X will occur. And now I am hearing from abductees that I have known over these 20 years, and they are all saying something along the lines of John Spalding, that the secret cannot be kept any longer, that this has to be open. Now, who is speaking? Is it the humans on their own, or is it because the humans have been implanted by the phenomenon with information that here we are at the end of 2008, headed into 2009, that there is something about right now, as John Spalding feels, is critical, and further, he raises this, I think, very disturbing question in my own mind. If something like idiopathic fibrosis that causes this breathing problem is linked from the standpoint of some medical point of view to exposure to radioactivity, how many cases of this terrible breathing disease on the planet might be linked to the phenomenon? And I did some Google search and find that there was a paper as recently as 2002 by medical people looking specifically at that issue of exposure to radioactivity. But Whitley, I'm going to throw this back to you with this question. Why would there be occasions when there might be radioactivity in the presence of something that might be non-human as a craft, when there are apparently so many other cases where there does not seem to be any radioactive exposure?
Well, you know, Linda, what can I tell you? I have the answer. I'm joking, sadly enough. I don't know. I just don't know. And that gets back to the fact that there is so much evidence on the ground that we really don't need to be told anything. We don't need disclosure. We need acknowledgement. If the federal government would simply say to the National Science Foundation, encourage scientific research into this area of phenomena, that'd be all we need. We don't have to listen to whatever kind of stuff may have come out of the intelligence community. Goodness knows. We know from the report from the Brits that in as late as 1956 we were shooting at them routinely. We know that they sent up armed jets over Stevensville just a few months ago.
Right.
So how good could their information be? I mean, how good was our information about what was going on in any country that we regard as an enemy? I mean, I don't think that the information that is in the possession of the intelligence community is necessarily going to be very valuable.
Right. And do you have any sense from other people that you know in the abduction syndrome that right now in November of 2008, is there an agitation, a nervousness about something ready to break?
Oh, yeah, but there always is. I'd say yes 5 years ago, 3 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. There's always the sense of incipience in the move in the field. It's always there. There's always the sense of something about to happen. This time, however, there are enough things going on. We have a new president. We have in John Podesta a man who is actively interested in the phenomenon and in disclosure, and he's involved in the new administration. We have great economic change taking place. We have extraordinary changes taking place in the environment. We are at the edge of the cliff, and there's no place to go. And I've always understood that when we were really up against it, and we really didn't have any other place to turn, would be when we would finally turn to this. Mm-hmm. And there is left in the bodies and minds of the close encounter witnesses, in the skies, in the materials that have been found and can be found connected with this, an entire, clear, and incredibly useful picture that we have only to bring into focus. Linda Moulton Howe, thank you very much for a very provocative report. And folks, never miss a week of Dreamland. You're missing too much. I've
spent a lot of time, as you've already mentioned, looking at ancient monuments around the world, but really, my first and foremost focus has been on Egypt. And what I've found is looking at not just the Egyptian monuments, but monuments in general, I had to ask myself, well, why are they building these huge monuments? This is sort of an eternal question. Why build a pyramid? Why put all the energy and time and resources into doing such a thing? I've never bought the standard argument that it's just, a huge tomb for a pharaoh in the case of the Great Pyramid, etc. And I found consistently that there are these stories, both ancient stories, and I don't mean that in any kind of derogatory way, but stories, tales, myths, if you would, legends, that interesting things are happening in these structures, in these monuments, in these temples, the Great Pyramid in particular, and they seem to relate to altered states of consciousness, if you want to put it that way, maintaining higher levels of consciousness. Sometimes it would be phrased in terms of connecting with the gods, going through some kind of spiritual evolution. And even though I might have been skeptical and I'm trained as a classical scientist, when you keep hearing the same types of stories over and over for different monuments around the world, I'm trained in part in anthropology, you see the same stories consistently among different cultures. You have that among ancient people. You have modern people saying they've experienced things. I had to start looking at and saying, might there be something to all of this?
Now, when you're talking about ancient people, many would suggest that the Great Pyramids were built around 2500 BC, and that would be approximately the date of the Sphinx. But you might have a different definition of ancient. Talk about that.
Ancient, much of ancient goes much further back. Those familiar with my work know that I sort of became, should we say, notorious at first for my work on the Great Sphinx. I was brought into that, as you already mentioned, by John Anthony West to look at the Great Sphinx geologically. And what I found is that the Sphinx does not go back just to 2500 BC, but it goes back thousands of years earlier.
How many thousands of years earlier?
At least 5,000 to 7,000 BC, so at least several thousand years earlier, maybe more than that. It's very difficult for me to say geologically how far back it could go, but we're talking at least 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years earlier than most Egyptologists would want to accept, or traditional Egyptologists would accept. And the thing is, this puts it well back into prior to dynastic times, well back before pharaonic times.
Well before 3000 BC.
Well before 3000 BC. And I've been told over and over, by classical Egyptologists and archaeologists, well, no one existed to build such a thing.
Right.
No one could have done that. And I say, that's not my problem. I'm a geologist. I'm telling you how far back it goes, and I'm very, comfortable with my data, and that, more and more evidence as we bring it in demonstrates it's correct.
And they can take it or leave it. I recently, I've interviewed Egyptologist or Egypt researcher Stephen Mailer. He had a teacher, Abdel Hakim, who was a local guide there in Giza, and Hakim told Stephen Mailer that the ancient Egyptians possessed 360 senses, some of which we today would have to call paranormal.
Right, exactly. I don't know about 360 per se, but certainly my research on ancient Egypt would confirm that they knew a lot more than we know now. For instance, a lot of people are familiar that the Egyptians had different concepts for different parts of the human. And when I say parts of the human, I'm not talking body parts. I'm talking, what we might call spirit, soul, shadow, etc. In fact, they had dozens of terms, which I think was not just redundancy, but in fact they were distinguishing different, what I'll call psychical aspects of human consciousness, human mentality.
So, did we possess advanced mental abilities in the field? This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. Welcome, everyone. Many believe a great shift in human consciousness is unfolding. We're literally morphing right before our eyes. And there's a sense among some that we're entering a period in which the human mind will reveal its potential superhuman powers and become, cosmic. This suggests that we are rediscovering ourselves and what it means to be human. Are we beings that can create or co-create our own realities? Our guest today, Dr. Robert Schoch, has deeply considered these questions from the vantage point of academia's highest towers and as a boots-on-the-ground investigator carrying out research on ancient pyramids and megalithic structures around the world. He's world famous for his work on dating the Sphinx and for taking on the Egyptology establishment. With John Anthony West, he created a paradigm shift in our understanding of ancient Egypt, and along the way, he collected important data about the mind. His latest work, The Parapsychology Revolution, a concise anthology of paranormal and psychical research, contains selections from 14 seminal papers dating from 1886 to 2007 by all the major figures in the field. Roberts concluded that the lessons of parapsychology may be crucial to addressing the current and future evolution of humanity. He's here to talk with us about human paranormal abilities as well as explore the possibility that ancient temples and ritual sites were used to focus energies and enhance Analoma's mental capabilities. Here is Dr. Robert Schoch. Robert, welcome to Dreamland.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
It was my pleasure to meet you recently, Dr. Schoch, at the CPAC conference.
Yeah, that was wonderful.
I really enjoyed your presentations, which I'd like to talk about you with here in a moment on our relationship with the Galactic Center and how it might, in fact, play a role in triggering paranormal abilities.
Okay.
Your interests, though, they run wide and deep. They focus on interrelationships, it seems, between geological and astronomical phenomena, natural catastrophes, the early history of human civilization. So how did this flow into an interest in parapsychology and advanced human capabilities?
Well, I have
past. Did we lose them, and how can we get them back?
Well, there certainly is a lot of evidence, in my opinion, that we humans did possess certain mental capabilities, let's call them advanced if you like, but things that we don't possess nowadays. And, I think that in some cases ancient cultures, people talk about ancient cultures being, maybe we've lost something, were they more sophisticated than us in some respects, and I think perhaps so, and not necessarily a technological or mechanical sophistication, although when you look at something like the Great Pyramid or the Great Sphinx, how were they doing that even from a basic technological aspect, how were they moving 70-ton blocks, et cetera, it boggles the mind. But I don't think that was actually the first and foremost concern of those ancient cultures. I think it was more what we could call mental consciousness, psychical abilities, and it's very difficult to know exactly what they were doing because we have lost so much.
It's been speculated that soon we'll be able to develop computer interface devices that will be able to pick up waveforms captured by trees or the antenna of bugs, and that we may be able to tap into those stones and read the waveforms.
In fact, that's something I'm very interested in and pursuing myself and others are pursuing, is how could these stones, how could the background, if you would, how could the monuments tap in and capture, how could we tap into them, how have they captured things in the past? Part of it, I think, is that it's not just the monuments themselves, but it's actually the spots on Earth. There are different, it's well known geologically, there are different geomagnetic forces on different spots in the Earth that manifest themselves. And it's also becoming better and better known that these geomagnetic forces affect us in terms of mental abilities, consciousness, etc. Well, so in some cases, they were clearly, in my mind, building temples, building pyramids, building structures on specific sites that would enhance consciousness.
Let me ask you this. You did your graduate work at Yale.
I did.
I was recently in New Haven. And,
wow.
Did a presentation on the Yale campus and had a chance to walk around, went to the library there, held the Voynich manuscript in my hands. That was a real treat. And
wow.
I met a gentleman who talked about the unusual geology of New Haven, or New Heaven.
Right.
And he was speculating that you've got all these volcanic escarpments there, and you've got the nearby place. I can't remember, what was the name of that? There's a special park there in New Haven, famous park.
Yeah, it's been decades since I've been there.
Yeah, well, what he was saying is that there's a reason why Yale is a king-making site in America. There's a reason why American presidents go to Yale.
Yeah,
why the titans of industry go to Yale. It's because of the geology of Yale.
Yeah, I think that makes some sense. You get certain areas environmentally that are conducive to, should we say, mental abilities processes. And I could easily see that in terms of New Haven.
Very interesting,
Yeah.
because it should suggest that when they're picking the locations of some of these early American sites, Yale dates back to the 17th century, 18th
right,
century.
Exactly.
That they knew.
They knew, and was it on a conscious level or was it on a subconscious level? Either way, I think they knew something. They were sensing something. And see, I think the same principles apply to the classical ancient sites. I believe in most cases it applies to, for instance, in Europe, sites for cathedrals, that type of thing, holy sacred sites. You're picking up something at those spots.
And what we need to do is just go there with an open heart, an open mind, and be able to kind of tap in. Those stones still speak to us. I've had the experience in Egypt and elsewhere of the stones speaking, and it's real.
It absolutely is real. I mean, I think once people experience it, and you know that firsthand, once people experience it, there's no denying it.
Robert, we've come up to a break here. When we get back, let's talk about a century of research